You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. Today we're talking sharks, specifically their interaction with fishermen, more often off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, with Marcus Drymon, marine fisheries professor at Mississippi State University Extension on the Gulf Coast.
This episode of Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is sponsored by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, Parks, and Marine.
All right, let's talk sharks with Marcus from the coast. Marcus, welcome to the show. Sharks.
Yeah, what can you say?
What can you say? And I was, joking around, headed down thinking, all right, I'm going to ask him, is it possible for sharks and tornadoes to, we won't go there. How about that?
I mean, the movies say that it is possible, so there must be something to it, right?
Right. As it relates to, what you do with the Extension Center on the coast and in working with sharks and the population here as it relates to the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
Let's start with this. We have a lot of sharks. We have few. What's the population like? What are the numbers like?
Yeah, so such a great question. I'm always quick to say that the northern Gulf where we live here is home to a rich diversity of sharks. So many different species, which is great. And increasingly over the past 20 years, we're seeing the numbers of each of those species start to increase, which there's a whole backstory to that. But yes, today the shark populations in coastal Mississippi are healthy.
Okay. All right. And from a fisheries standpoint, so we think about fishermen and fisheries, what, and maybe a starting point is, what is that relationship like then with that population and then boats and rods and reels and people fishing and how these things are kind of interacting together? Like, where do we start that conversation?
Yeah. It's a complex conversation to be honest. And there's this coexistence. I mean, we think back, the Pulitzer Prize winning novel, The Old Man and the Sea, right? At its heart, it's a conflict between a fisherman and a shark that's eating what the fisherman just caught. And so a science nerds, that's called depredation. So predation, but with a DE in front of it. And the short story is that depredation, at least according to all the anglers I speak with, depredation has been increasing along the coast of Mississippi, but also Alabama, Florida, all of the Gulf states. We're seeing an increase in that because of these healthy shark populations and because there are more and more anglers on the water.
Okay. And so what you're touching on then is there's more instances of fishermen encountering sharks when they're not necessarily fishing for sharks, right?
That's exactly right. Okay. So in this country and in this part of the world, when a fisherman goes out to fish, he's probably not trying to catch a shark. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but by and large, our fishermen are chasing things that they want to eat or that are really fun to catch and release, right? And so the conflict comes when a fisherman gets on the water, spends a lot of money in gas and ice and, has a big expensive boat, goes way offshore. After all that effort, finally hooks up to a really nice fish, a red snapper, a wahoo, a tuna, it doesn't matter. And before that fish can fully be retrieved, before it gets landed on the boat, sometimes what we see is a shark will come up and take a big bite out of it. And that's an interaction, again, called depredation, which is really, really frustrating to any angler you talk to, any marine angler you talk to in the past handful of years, they're going to mention the shark problem.
Right. Okay. And so they come to you now in 2020, almost at 2026 and say, what? I'm seeing more. This is happening more often.
That's exactly it. I mean, precisely what they say is, what are you going to do about the shark problem?
Okay.
They say
shark problem.
Yeah. And that's how they phrase it. And from their viewpoint, it is a problem. And I get that. I should state, I'm a fisherman myself. And I've been sharked many times. It's frustrating.
Yeah.
You invest all this time and money and effort to, hunt these fish like we do, track them down, get them on the line, get them on the bite. And then before you can get it to the boat, shark comes and quote unquote steals it. I mean, you could make the argument a shark's just doing what a shark does, which is eating fish. But yeah, the question or the complaint I get from anglers is, what can you do about the shark problem?
Mm-hmm. So then how do you answer that?
Well, it depends on the time.
Okay.
If we've got a little bit of time, I'll get into a little bit of an explanation. But more so than that, it depends on the relationship. If it's someone I don't know and if they're angry, I say, yeah, man, I hear you. There are more sharks out there today than there were 20 years ago. I definitely get that. Better case scenario, it's someone that I know, it's someone I've developed a bit of a rapport with, and they know where I'm coming from, and I can kind of walk them through the trajectory and say, hey, yeah, there are more sharks today than 20 years ago, but that's a good thing because 20 years ago, we hammered their populations and they were really, really depressed. Like those populations were very much in the tank, right? And our oceans don't function well without healthy shark populations. So I would make the argument we've actually worked really hard over the past 30 years to help these shark populations slowly recover to levels where they should have been all along.
Okay.
But with that comes this increased interaction, this increased conflict. So I would argue it's up to us as fishermen to figure out a way around that. I mean, that's what fishermen do, right? They're presented with the challenge and they figure out how to beat that challenge. And that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying is if I'm looking at a graph of, let's say, shark population in our waters off the coast, it's not that, hey, here's history, here's where they are, it's here. And then all of a sudden here in the last 20 years, it shot up. It's not that.
No.
You're saying this has been it historically, but 20 years ago we had this dip, and over the last 20 years now it's kind of getting back up to where it was or should be.
You nailed it. I mean, and just to introduce a little bit more unnecessarily fancy science, we call that shifting baselines. So in other words, each new succession of angler looks at their current state of the oceans, for example, and assumes that that's the baseline, right? Okay. But if you look back at the data and you look back at fishing reports from the 30s and the 40s, guys were getting sharked like crazy because there were a lot of sharks out there. There were fewer anglers, right? There were no cell phones in the 1930s, no social media. So those instances weren't that well reported. But then you fast forward over time, populations of anglers have been steadily increasing. Populations of things that we like to fish for, like red snapper, they took a pretty big hit there in the 90s, early 2000s. And so did sharks. As commercial fishermen started to target sharks as a marketable product, landings really peaked about 1989, and they've really gone down since then. But again, after 30 years of management, those numbers are finally coming back up. So that's a long way of describing exactly what you said. Here's the baseline. It dipped, and we're just now getting back to where it should be.
Okay. So naturally then, if, like you said, I'm basically repeating what you already said, but if you've had a fisherman who they're a lifetime angler, they were fishing, at the turn of the century back in 2000 and experienced all of that. You think of a guide or someone like that. And now with the increased numbers, it's back up to where it was historically, but more than what they experienced 20 years ago.
Exactly.
Well, and then you say, okay, but that's good.
Right.
What do we say to them to help them understand why that's good overall?
And that's where it gets into that. How well do I know this angler? Because I don't mean to be crass and I don't mean to discount the fact that especially these guides, they make their living on the water, right? Yeah. So I'm not trying to say that the life of this shark is worth more than the life of this fishing guide, because I don't think that at all. Sharks are a natural resource, just like a red snapper or a speckled trout. So I just try to describe to them, this is the new normal. So we just have to figure out ways around that. Once you get sharked at a certain location, change spots. I know that's a pain in the butt. I know you got your spots you like to go to, but once that depredation happens, you got to move. Use heavier tackle when you can. Reduce that fight time. I know there's a lot of enjoyment in the fight itself. And as a fly fisherman, I take that to the extreme, right? Yeah. So I get that. But that is going to increase the amount of time that fish is susceptible to being sharked.
Yeah.
And, it's time for us to consider some of these deterrent devices, little electronic devices, little magnetic devices that we can put on our fishing tackle to help keep sharks away from caught fish.
Yeah, makes total sense. Is there This may even be rhetorical. I kind of feel like I know the answer, but you mentioned the spots.
Yeah.
Fishermen over the years kind of go to some of the same spots. Some of those species have the same, annual and seasonal patterns that trains sharks where they're going to be and where that's going to be happening, I guess, right?
I mean, you got it. Like, you're telling me things that I would normally be telling fishermen. This is exactly the case, right? So if there are these seasonally prevalent aggregations of fish, well, the sharks know that.
Yeah.
They've learned that eons ago,
Yeah.
right? And more so, if anglers are repeatedly going back to the same spot and they see these fish that are tethered, essentially, when you catch a fish, you've got it tethered, right?
Yeah.
So it's an easy meal. So the sharks are essentially being habituated. That, hey, man, if I hang out at this spot for too long, I'm going to see a fish struggling attached to a line. I can just go grab it.
Yeah.
And that's a lot easier than trying to hunt my own food.
Sure. So that's one of the solutions, or a couple that you mentioned. How big of a challenge is that for an offshore fisherman? It's no big deal, just change spots. Or is that kind of a big deal?
It's a big deal.
Okay.
So, and again, I don't say that lightly.
Yeah.
It's a big deal. And this is also difficult if you're talking to pelagic fishermen that are trolling, for tunas, billfish, and things like that. They're not fishing structure. And so that's a bit of a difficult argument. They don't want to hear that. And I get it. It's a totally different situation. But for those folks that are fishing on the bottom, fishing hard structures, especially if it's a public area that a lot of people know, well, a lot of sharks know that too. And so I'm just saying, to the extent possible, move locations, fish less popular spots, and things like that.
What type of shark species within the species are these that we're talking about that are happening the most? These encounters are happening the most.
That's a really good question. I feel like we finally got a pretty good answer. So mostly it's sandbar sharks, bull sharks, and blacktip sharks.
Okay.
And really, from a population standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. Blacktip sharks are not overfished. They're not experiencing overfishing. Their populations are healthy. Sandbar sharks, get this, they were put on a harvest moratorium in 2008 because they were overfished to the extent that we needed to put a complete lockdown on the fishery.
Wow.
So for more than 15 years, no one has been able to catch and remove a sandbar shark from the ocean. So definitely their populations are increasing, right?
Yeah,
We expect that. And our studies have shown, more times than not, they're the ones doing the depredation. And bull sharks, it's the kind of same thing. Like, we live in a part of the world that's perfect for bull sharks. If you think about sort of estuarine influenced, kind of muddy, silty water, that's just what a bull shark likes. So, that prevalence of really high quality habitat for bull sharks and the fact that they're not very marketable means that their populations have increased also.
From a fisheries management perspective, that's one thing for me. We get to talk to folks who, crappie fisheries, private ponds, the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
And anything about the ocean.
Yeah.
It's a whole different, pardon the pun, but a whole different animal you're dealing with here in terms of, managing a fishery, I would think.
It really is, and in the past 10 years, kind of the management of species like red snapper, gray triggerfish, that's gone back more towards the state agencies to manage, which is good. But things like sharks and tunas and billfish, collectively we call those HMS, highly migratory species. Those are managed by NOAA Fisheries. They can't very well be managed by the state because a shark you see in Florida one day could well be in Texas, 5 days later. And so there is a bit of a management disconnect there with respect to the fisheries, the species that folks are targeting, and the sharks that are doing the biting.
Yeah. Back to the interaction, fishermen and the shark encounters. Let's kind of circle back and you tell me what is really the primary message that someone who has clicked play on this podcast and this affects them directly, maybe they've had the experience and that's why they're listening. What's the primary message that we want those fishermen on the coast to get from this conversation about this subject?
My primary message to a fisherman on the coast who's experienced depredation is, I understand your frustration. I'm not here saying that every shark deserves 100% protection. I'm just giving a perspective that there are approaches, tools, techniques that we can use to lessen the probability of that happening. That's the main message. The second message, which is going to be a little bit harder to stomach, is that we actually want to see this level of sharks in the ocean. It's a good thing. It makes our fishing more difficult. It definitely does. But if we look at the levels of some of these other fisheries that we've, like red snapper, amberjack, triggerfish, I would argue that the fishing is actually better now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. By and large, if you talk to fishermen, they're pleased with the levels of these other fish that they're targeting. No one's going out and coming back after 12 days of fishing with nothing in the box, right? So along with those healthy stocks come healthy shark populations. It's all, it's all a system.
Yeah, it's all related. So speaking of that, our water is off the coast of Mississippi, and in our neighbor state, you and I were talking about, you spent time in Mobile and Dauphin Island and those areas. That whole swath of the Gulf where there's people swimming and everything else, are there concentrations of those shark populations? Like some places you don't see them, some places you're guaranteed you will?
That's a great question. It's not so much a geographic concentration as seasonal pulses, right? Like any of these animals on the wall, they undergo large-scale migrations. And sharks are no different. We expect to see them moving into certain parts of the Gulf during certain times of the year. A species like a blacktip shark is a perfect example of that. It's almost every summer I get a call from a news station somewhere in coastal Alabama where someone's been flying a drone off Gulf shores where that water's super clear. And they say, oh my gosh, look at all these sharks. And the question I get from the reporters is this normal? And for the past, 8 years or so, I've said, yep. This is definitely normal. So much so that the most recent call I got from a reporter in coastal Alabama, they said, oh, you're Marcus Drymon, the shark guy. Yeah, I remember this conversation. I now know that this isn't even newsworthy, hardly. This is just something we see because everyone's got a drone. So yeah. So, it's a neat thing. And that's another message I'd like to convey is it's cool to see these sharks in coastal environments. I would venture that very few, if any, of the listeners to this podcast have ever actually been bitten by a shark.
Yeah, very few overall. This is a question that I just have to ask you, and Chip may choose to edit it out.
Yeah.
But then I see the pictures every now and then of an alligator swimming up on the beach, like at Dauphin Island.
Yep.
And I know, what's your experience with that? What can you tell us about the...
Yeah, honestly, I know virtually nothing about alligators, but I know that, these highly mobile predators, they're adaptable, so when conditions change, they have the ability to move, so that's one of the things that makes them really interesting to study, makes them challenging to study, honestly. Yeah. But yeah, seeing something like an alligator up on the beach at Dauphin Island, that's a cool thing.
Yeah. And the pictures are cool. You can get 1 million, clicks, likes on if you put the picture on Facebook.
Yes, you can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hey, you mentioned earlier that people were fishing. Is it sandbar sharks that you were talking about? Why are people fishing for those? Like, what's the purpose? I guess anytime I've ever seen somebody catch a shark, it was on mistake. It was a mistake that they caught the shark.
Yeah, so really good point. When we think about sandbar sharks in the Gulf, we have to remember that there was a commercial fishery for sharks, right? So NOAA Fisheries, in response to stocks of all these other, what we call finfish, red snapper, grouper, tilefish, whatever, as those stocks went down, NOAA Fisheries in the early 80s, mid 80s said, hey, maybe we should ask fishermen to consider targeting sharks instead. That's another source of protein. They could make a living doing that. And so fishermen did that, and they got very good at that. Now, sandbar sharks are an interesting example. They happen to have a very large dorsal fin. And, to be honest, the dorsal fins, or the fins in general of sharks, tend to be the most valuable product for a specific dish served in Asia called shark fin soup. So fishermen were targeting these sandbar sharks. They'd sell the meat, but they could also sell the fins, and that's where a lot of their profit came from.
Yeah.
So because of that, in the late 90s, all through the early 2000s, that stock of sandbar sharks became overfished.
Okay.
That's one thing as someone who thinks about sharks a lot. There's a really good understanding that in general, sharks are very slow growing. They're very late to mature. They don't mature till they're relatively old. And when they produce, they have relatively few offspring. So for those reasons and about 10 more, when you overharvest their populations, they don't bounce back right away. And so we're seeing it takes 30 years, right, for these populations to slowly get back to where they were before commercial fishing really lowered those population levels.
Yeah. It's really interesting too to think about, a 30-year project.
Yeah.
Ultimately, from implementation to results.
Yeah.
You think about, there aren't many people, not many of us who work in a field where we got a 30-year plan.
Yeah.
I mean, we got 30-year mortgages, but not 30-year plans.
Yeah, and I use that value of 30 years very specifically. The first fishery management plan for sharks in the Atlantic Ocean, U.S. Atlantic Ocean, was implemented in 1993. So in 2023, just a couple years ago, we celebrated 30 years of efforts to rebuild these overfished populations. And I got to hand it to NOAA Fisheries, the group responsible for that task. They've done a tremendous job, and they're getting attacked from both sides, right? There are people that say we should not be fishing for any sharks at all. And then there are people that say there are so many sharks out there, we need to kill every single one we see. And, NOAA Fisheries is doing the best they can based on the best available science. Where I'm sitting, they've done a really good job.
Yeah. Sharks, and you think about populations. Well, obviously we're talking about reproduction, but that's a very different thing for sharks than other fish, right?
It is, and I'm always quick to start off by saying sharks are fish, of course, but they behave much differently than most fish. They're cartilaginous fish, whereas things like red snapper and red grouper are bony fish. Most of those bony fish, the females are pumping out millions of eggs, males pumping out tons of sperm, and there's a hope that all mixes up in the water column together. Sharks, they copulate, like a mammal does. And then many of the sharks in our part of the world give live birth. So they may only have, 3, 4, maybe a dozen pups at once. And crazy to say this, but the females actually have 2 uteri. So, I always like to point that out, that gestation, so how long those sharks are inside the uterus, can be every bit of 12 months. So really, when you think about how a shark reproduces, it's much more like a human reproduces than like a bony fish reproduces. And so that has consequences for their population sustainability because they reproduce relatively infrequently compared to a red snapper. It means that we have to be more careful in how we harvest them.
Yeah. And I guess a factor in some of the things you talked about with, like, say, the sandbar sharks and 30 years to get that population. It's a much slower reproduction process, what you're talking about.
It is. So those pups, when they're born, they're fully functional. They're ready to be on their own. They can start hunting right away. There's not any more additional maternal investment. But that shark, that newborn shark, it might need to grow for 10 years before it can reproduce.
Yeah,
now, for some of the smaller species of shark, they can reproduce after 3-4 years, something like that. But some of these sandbar sharks, dusky sharks, things like that, they take much longer to reach an age where they can start contributing back to the population.
Okay. So like when I'm on the beach, say at Dauphin Island, I see someone fishing from the beach and we get photo op with a little shark that's about this long. That's kind of what we're talking about right there.
It is and it isn't, right? So a lot of the little sharks you see, especially on Dauphin Island, they might be what we call young of the year, blacktip. So one that was just born that summer.
Okay.
That said, the most common shark in our part of the world is called the Atlantic sharpnose shark. That only gets to be about that big, full grown.
Okay.
Another relatively small-bodied shark is the bonnethead, which looks just like a small hammerhead. But that would be a big bonnethead. Whereas on the other hand, a bull shark, when it's born, a full, like the day it's born, a bull shark is this big.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be 12 of those suckers stacked up inside those 2 uteri of the mom. So it's nuts. I mean, and some of these little sharks use these nearshore areas around Dauphin Island as nurseries. Mobile Bay is a particularly well-documented nursery for bull sharks. But the adults of many species tend to be a little bit further offshore.
Yeah. Do sharks eat birds?
It's interesting. You wouldn't imagine that's outside the realm of possibility for things like seagulls, pelicans. Those birds must die at some point. And many sharks are scavengers. But I'll tell you this is interesting. We were doing our shark survey, which involves just catching a lot of sharks over and over using the same techniques. It gives us an idea of the population level. We were doing that survey and we caught a little tiger shark, about 3 feet long. So that was born that year. That's a baby. As we put it on the boat, lifted it on the table, we're getting ready to measure it and put a tag in it and let it go. And it throws up a whole bunch of feathers. We're like, oh man, that's cool. And being the science nerds we gathered up all those feathers and put them in a bag. And we're going to look at them back in the lab. And I took the feathers to a bird guy. I'm like, man, what kind of feathers are these? And he broke out a bird ID book and said, holy cow, those are from a brown thrasher. Because I was expecting him to say a seagull or something like that, cormorant. He said, no, they're from a brown thrasher, a songbird.
Yeah.
I was like, holy cow. So over those next several years, we took every opportunity we could to put a big tube, imagine a PVC tube, in the mouth of these tiger sharks, put a hose in the end of that tube and rinse out all their stomach contents into a big sieve. And you'd be shocked at the prevalence of the songbird feathers that we would find in their stomachs.
So, and different kinds of songbirds.
Yes.
Okay. In the stomachs of sharks, how are they intersecting? How are they in the same vicinity? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's the question we had. How in the world is this happening? Because it's not just a one-off event, right? We're seeing this repeatedly in over several years and specifically at certain seasons. So, not being a bird guy, we reached out to some bird folks at Mississippi State. And we're like, hey, can you help us figure this out? And so we started slowly putting together these pieces. And our best guess is as these songbirds migrate from the Yucatan Peninsula across the Gulf, Dauphin Island is literally the first place they land after that 24 to 40-hour flight. And they're exhausted. Now, what happens to the ones that just don't make it? They don't have enough fat reserves. So they take a nosedive off the coast of Alabama somewhere, and these young tiger sharks have incorporated that as a routine part of their diet.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Back to the sort of, habitual stuff year round in different seasons of knowing where and, where the food's going to be.
That's it.
And they sort of become trained to where that is. That is really wild.
It's fascinating. And it just gets back to what I mentioned earlier about, studying these animals right when you think you've kind of got a part of their ecology figured out. You see something completely unexpected. And that's one of the really fun aspects of my job.
All right. Here's another one from out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But I witnessed this. I say I witnessed it. We were in the vicinity this past summer, read about it because it was happening at the time over in Mobile Bay.
Sure.
It was called a Jubilee.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard of it before. And I was watching local news down there and reading things about it. Like, look at this. And I'm seeing videos on social media of they called it a Jubilee chip. And in the middle of the night, you could go out there and look, and all these just thousands and thousands and thousands of fish, not dead, I'm talking about live flounder and any, are just right there for the taking in that shallow water. And I was really fascinated to read that this is something that, again, according to what I was told, nobody knows when it's going to happen,
right,
and when it's coming, and or really how to manage it,
right.
And then it's not funny, but I got a kick out of apparently there were some people that like, well, let's take advantage of this. Well, they didn't have fishing license, so you get picked up for having a flounder, and you don't have a fishing license because technically it is fishing, even though you can it's just right there.
All of that's true, with a few minor clarifications, right? I'd say 99.5% of the folks don't know when that's going to happen.
Okay.
But I think some of the old timers, they've kind of figured it out. There's some, there's a bit of a cycle to it because it's a naturally occurring phenomenon.
Okay.
It has to do with salinity and dissolved oxygen and wind and time of the year and stuff like that. So if you've been around long enough and you've seen enough of those, because they don't happen all the time.
It's not an every year thing.
No, it's not predictable. It's not something that can be managed. But yeah, people should, people do, and in my opinion, should take advantage of those fish that they see kind of floundering, pardon the pun, up on the beach, But it's interesting. Mobile Bay, particularly the eastern shore, is really one of only a handful of spots on the planet where that phenomenon takes place.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Okay, so there aren't any areas over here on the Mississippi side of the coast where we see that happening. It's just right over there.
It is. Sadly, we don't have that in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the very few things that we don't have from a fishery standpoint in Mississippi. It's really fascinating to think about. For you right now, at this point in your career, when you look at just kind of overall, I know we talk about sharks, but overall where things are from a marine fishery standpoint on the coast, healthy, is it great? Is it a 10 out of 10? Is there improvement? Lots to work on? I know that's a big open-ended question, but.
No, I'd love to talk about that. Yeah. Honestly, it's at least an 8 out of 10, if not a 9 out of 10. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but I got to hand it to the scientists working in this part of the world and the fishery managers. They're all doing a tremendous job. The data collection is getting better and better, and how the managers are using that data to set limits and targets, that's becoming better. We're doing, I say we, extension professionals, scientists, managers are doing a better job of explaining to the general public why we need them to report their catches, how that data is used in a stock assessment. So, overall, the U.S. and particularly here in the Gulf, we've got some of the best, most well-managed fisheries on the planet. And so it's a great time to be a fisheries professional in this part of the world. I love it. I wouldn't leave here, if I was drug out kicking and screaming. So I'd say things look really good right now, and the future is only brighter.
Yeah, that's great. From Middle Kentucky to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and Alabama, heck of a career. When did you decide as a youngin' that's what I'm going to do?
Yeah, that's a good question because you're not really exposed to sharks that much in central Kentucky.
No.
But I was fortunate, my dad and I both loved scuba diving from an early age, and I had the chance to go to a lot of different places, do a lot of snorkeling and scuba diving from a very young age. And I remember, like most kids, kind of being scared of sharks when you see one in the water.
Yeah.
It's a predator. And that fear very quickly kind of morphed into a fascination, let's say around age 8 to 10. And here I am, I'm almost 50. That fascination has still, it's only increased. Like it's one of those things, the more you learn about these animals, the cooler they become. So I'm really fortunate to have this opportunity to study these animals that I've been captivated by since, early childhood.
Yeah. Well, much like a shark, the more we learn about you, the cooler you become too, Marcus. Really do appreciate you being here today. It's been great.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yep. He is Marcus Drymon with the Extension Service professor there, Marine Fisheries on the Coast, on the show. Hope you enjoyed that. I know I did too. We'll see you outdoors.